The white dress was the first thing Arthur Morgan noticed. It was a stark, impossible slash of white against the dun-colored dust of Redemption Gulch's main street, a town that had long since forgotten such clean things existed. The dress was sullied at the hem, torn at the sleeve, but it was undeniably white, and the woman wearing it was crumpled on the splintered boardwalk in front of the closed-down assayer's office like a discarded letter. She was Chinese, her black hair having come loose from its pins, and she was so still Arthur feared she was already gone. He pulled his horse, Bess, to a halt. The gelding snorted, shaking its head, uneasy. The town was watching. Arthur could feel the eyes from the windows of the general store, from the shaded doorway of the saloon. No one was moving to help. They were looking at her the way they might look at a stray dog with a broken leg, a problem someone else would eventually have to handle. Arthur was a man who preferred to be that someone else. He dismounted, his worn leather boots making no sound in the thick dust. As he drew closer, he saw she was breathing. Her shoulders shuddered with shallow, ragged breaths. One of her hands was curled into a fist, the knuckles scraped raw. The other lay open, palm up, as if in supplication. Her face was turned away from him, pressed against the rough wood of the boardwalk. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and raspy from the dry air. "Ma'am, are you all right?" There was no response. He knelt, the worn denim of his trousers protesting. He could smell the faint metallic scent of blood now, and saw a dark stain seeping through the fabric of her dress near her ankle. Gently, he reached out and touched her shoulder. She flinched violently, a small cry escaping her lips, and tried to pull away. "Easy now," Arthur said, holding his hands up where she could see them. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Arthur Morgan. My ranch is a few miles out of town." She slowly, painfully, pushed herself up to a sitting position. Her face was bruised along one cheekbone, her eyes wide with a terror that went deeper than any physical hurt. She couldn't be more than 25. She looked at him, then at the silent, watching windows of the town, and a look of profound, bottomless despair settled over her features. She said nothing, only pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping her arms around them, making herself as small as possible. Jedediah Vance, the owner of the general store, finally emerged, wiping his hands on his apron. He was a man whose opinions were as narrow as the brim of his hat. "Best leave that be, Art," Vance called out, his voice carrying the weight of town authority. "Her people put her out, not our concern." "Her people?" Arthur asked, not taking his eyes off the woman. "The Chins, the old man and his wife," Vance elaborated, gesturing vaguely with his thumb toward the east where the railroad crews had once camped. "They were on the morning freight wagon, left her right there, said she was no longer their responsibility." Arthur's jaw tightened. He had seen the Chins in town before, a hard, grasping pair who had come over to work the railroad and stayed on, taking whatever scraps they could. To abandon their own kin like this was a coldness that settled ill in Arthur's gut. "She's hurt," Arthur said, his voice flat. "That's as may be," Vance replied, unmoved. "But she ain't from here. She's a stray. You take in a stray, you're responsible for all its troubles." He turned and went back inside his store, the screen door slamming shut with an air of finality. The message was clear. The town had rendered its verdict. Arthur looked back at the woman. Her eyes were closed now, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. He couldn't leave her here. It wasn't in him. His own life was a quiet, solitary affair, a patchwork of hard work and small comforts on a piece of land he'd carved out of the wilderness with his own two hands. It was a life built on the principle that you stood up for what needed standing up for, even if you were the only one standing. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice softer this time, "I can't leave you here. You can come back to my place. It's not much, but it's safe. There's food and clean water. You can rest." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face for the trick, the hidden price. He met her gaze steadily, letting her see the simple truth of his offer. He didn't know what else to do. After a long moment, she gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Getting her to her feet was a slow process. Her ankle was badly swollen, and she winced with every movement. He was gentle, his large, calloused hands supporting her with a steadiness that seemed to surprise her. He led her to Bess, and with some difficulty lifted her onto the saddle. She was lighter than a sack of grain. He swung up behind her, taking the reins, keenly aware of her small, trembling frame pressed against his chest. As they rode out of town, he didn't look back at the watching windows. He already knew what they were thinking. He just didn't care. What he did not yet know was that this single act of decency would cost him more than he could possibly imagine. The ride to his ranch was silent, save for the rhythmic clopping of Bess's hooves and the sigh of the wind through the sagebrush. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, seemed to shrink with every mile, as if the vast empty landscape was swallowing her whole. When his small, sturdy cabin came into view, nestled in a shallow valley beside a creek, a small measure of the tension left her shoulders. He helped her down, half carrying her to the porch and setting her gently in the rocking chair his father had built. "Wait here," he said, and went inside. He returned a moment later with a basin of warm water, a bar of lye soap, and a clean linen cloth. He knelt before her, placing the basin on the porch boards. She watched him with a wary confusion, her hands clutching the arms of the chair. When he reached for the hem of her white dress to get to her injured ankle, she flinched and pulled back. "I need to see to that foot," he explained calmly. "It's swelling something fierce. Need to clean it, lest it gets infected." She hesitated, then slowly extended her leg. He carefully rolled up the sullied fabric of her dress, revealing a badly twisted ankle, already turning a dark, angry purple. Her foot was coated in dust and scraped raw in several places. Without a word, he submerged the cloth in the warm water, wrung it out, and began to gently wash her foot. He was methodical, his touch surprisingly deft for a man whose hands were mapped with the scars and calluses of ranch work. He cleaned away the dirt and the dried blood, his movements deliberate and respectful. She watched him, her breath catching in her throat. No one had ever touched her with such care. Her husband had been a rough man, and his parents colder still. This stranger's simple, quiet act of service was more intimate than any she had ever known. When he was done cleaning the wound, he dried her skin with a fresh part of the cloth and looked up at her. "What's your name?" he asked. Her voice was a whisper, rough from disuse. "Maylin." "Arthur Morgan," he repeated. "Well, Maylin, you're safe here." He went back inside and returned with a jar of pungent salve which he applied to her cuts, and then wrapped her ankle tightly with a clean bandage. He brought her a glass of water, which she drank down in 3 long swallows. He then helped her inside to a small cot he'd set up near the hearth, the only other sleeping place besides his own bed. She sank onto it, exhausted, and was asleep before he had even finished pulling a blanket over her. Arthur stood there for a moment, looking down at her. The harsh afternoon light filtering through the single window softened the bruises on her face. In sleep she looked younger, the terror replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He had brought a storm to his doorstep, he knew that. Jedediah Vance was the voice of the town, and that voice had already condemned him. But looking at Maylin, so utterly broken and alone, he knew he couldn't have done anything different. He banked the fire, checked the water barrel, and went outside to tend to his stock. The ordinary chores felt different now, weighted with the presence of the stranger sleeping in his home. He had offered her shelter, but he had a feeling he was the one who was about to be changed. The next few days passed in a quiet routine. Maylin's ankle began to heal, the swelling slowly receding. She spoke little, her English halting and uncertain, but she communicated with her actions. As soon as she could limp around the small cabin, she began to make herself useful. She mended a tear in his work shirt with stitches so small and perfect they were nearly invisible. She took over the cooking, transforming his simple stores of flour, beans, and salted pork into flavorful meals with the few dried spices she found in his pantry. She was neat and methodical, bringing a sense of order to his bachelor's existence that he hadn't realized was missing. Arthur, in turn, was a patient and gentle host. He never pressed her for details about what had happened, sensing the wounds were too raw. He talked to her as he went about his day, telling her about the ranch, the seasons, the habits of the coyotes that yipped in the hills at night. He spoke of the land with a deep, abiding respect, and she listened, her head tilted, her expressive eyes following his every move. A fragile trust began to grow between them in the shared silence of the cabin. But the peace of the ranch was an illusion, a small island in a hostile sea. Arthur knew the bill for his decency would eventually come due. It arrived a week later when he rode into town for supplies. The moment he tied Bess to the hitching post outside the general store, he felt the change. The usual nods of greeting from other ranchers were absent. Men who had known him for years suddenly found something interesting to look at across the street. The air was thick with unspoken judgment. He pushed open the screen door to Vance's store, a small bell announcing his arrival. Jedediah Vance was behind the counter, polishing a glass jar with a rag. He didn't look up. "Need a sack of flour, coffee, and some cartridges for the Winchester," Arthur said, his voice even. Vance continued to polish the jar, his movements slow and deliberate. "Can't help you, Art." Arthur stood still. "You're telling me you're out of flour?" "I'm telling you I'm not selling to you," Vance said, finally meeting his gaze. His eyes were cold. "Folks in this town, we look out for each other. We have certain standards. When a man brings trouble into the community, we don't reward him with our business." "The only trouble I see," Arthur said, keeping his voice low, "is a woman left for dead in the street. I did what any decent man would have." "Decent men don't take in foreign strays of questionable character," Vance shot back, his voice rising. A few other customers in the store stopped their browsing to watch. "She was cast out by her own family. What does that tell you? You've brought a stain on this town, Morgan, and on yourself." Anger, hot and sharp, coiled in Arthur's stomach. He wanted to reach across the counter and wipe the smug certainty off Vance's face, but he knew that violence would only prove the man's point. He had to be better than that. "She's a widow, Jedediah, a human being." "She's a problem," Vance countered. "And now she's your problem, and by extension, you're ours. Get out of my store." Arthur held Vance's gaze for a long moment, the silence in the store crackling with tension. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. The screen door slammed behind him. He stood on the boardwalk, his fists clenched, the public humiliation burning in his chest. He was being ostracized, cut off. In a place like Redemption Gulch, that was a slow death sentence. Supplies, tools, credit, it all ran through Vance's store. He rode home with an empty sack and a heavy heart. He had known there would be consequences, but he hadn't expected them to be so swift and so absolute. When he reached the ranch, he saw May Lynn on the porch. She had been watching for him. She saw his face, saw the empty supply bags, and she knew. The light in her eyes, which had just begun to return, dimmed once more. She looked down at her hands, a flicker of guilt and shame crossing her features. "It is my fault," she whispered as he stepped onto the porch. "No," Arthur said, his voice firm. He stopped in front of her. "This is not your fault. This is on them, on their ignorance and their fear." But his words felt hollow, even to him. Fear was a powerful thing on the frontier, and Vance had managed to turn the entire town's fear against him. That night, as he lay in his bed, listening to the quiet rhythm of Maylin's breathing from the cot across the room, he felt a profound sense of isolation. It was him and her against the world. He just wasn't sure it was a fight they could win. The next morning, Arthur discovered the true extent of his troubles. While checking his fence line along the northern pasture, he found a notice nailed to a post. It was an official-looking document from the Territorial Land Office, a preliminary notice of challenge to his homestead claim. It cited a clause about behavior detrimental to the community, and was signed by 3 of Redemption Gulch's leading citizens. The first signature, bold and angry, was Jedediah Vance's. A cold dread settled in Arthur's stomach. This wasn't just about supplies anymore. Vance was trying to take his land. The one thing he had in the world. The legacy his father had started and he had bled for. The claim required 5 years of continuous improvement and habitation. He was in his 4th year. A successful challenge now could wipe it all away. He tore the notice from the post and rode back to the cabin, his mind racing. He could fight it, but it would be his word against half the town. He could send Maylin away, beg the town for forgiveness, and maybe save his land. The thought was a bitter acid in his throat. To abandon her now would be to become the very thing he despised, no better than her in-laws or Jedediah Vance. He found Maylin in the small barn, not resting as he'd advised, but carefully stitching a piece of thick leather. She was repairing his saddle cinch, which had been fraying for months. Her stitches were as precise and strong as the ones she'd used on his shirt. She had found a way to contribute, to pull her own weight, to refuse to be a burden. She looked up as he entered, her brow furrowed in concentration. She held up the repaired cinch. "He's strong now," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. He looked at the cinch, then at the legal notice crumpled in his hand, and finally at her. He saw not a burden or a stray, but a woman of quiet strength and resilience, a woman who had faced the worst of humanity and was still trying to mend the world, one careful stitch at a time. The choice became clear. It was no choice at all. He could not, would not, abandon her. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that in choosing to protect her, he might have just damned them both. The land could be lost. But some things, he was beginning to realize, were worth more than dirt. That evening the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. Arthur had explained the notice from the land office, his voice grim. Maylin had listened without interruption, her face pale. When he finished, she simply bowed her head. "I will go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I bring you this trouble. I will not let you lose your home because of me." "No," Arthur said, the word sharper than he intended. He softened his tone. "You're not going anywhere. This is your home now, too. We'll face this together." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Why?" she asked, the single word holding a universe of confusion and disbelief. "Why do you do this for me?" Arthur sat down at the small wooden table across from her. He looked at his calloused hands, then back at her. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because when I found you in that street, I saw something of myself, alone, with the world looking the other way." It was more than he had ever admitted to anyone, perhaps even to himself. The confession hung in the air between them. In that moment, the wall of politeness and gratitude that had separated them crumbled. She saw him not as a savior, but as a man, lonely and principled. He saw her not as a victim, but as a survivor. She reached into the collar of her simple dress and pulled out a small, flat object on a leather cord. It was a jade pendant, a pale green, worn smooth with time. She held it out on her palm. "My mother gave this to me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It is all I have left of my home, of my family before I was married." She told him then, the story pouring out of her in a halting, painful rush. Her husband, a good man but a gambler, had been killed in a rock slide working on a new railroad spur. His parents, the Chins, had blamed her for his death, for the bad luck she had supposedly brought them. They took the small payment from the railroad company and every coin her husband had saved. They saw her as another mouth to feed, a worthless daughter-in-law with no son to bind her to them. So they had taken a wagon to the next town, a place where no one knew them, and left her in the street. "The white dress," she confessed, a deep blush of shame coloring her cheeks. "It was my wedding dress, the only good one I owned. I hoped someone might see it and show pity." Arthur listened, his heart aching with a cold fury. The casual cruelty of it was staggering. He reached across the table and gently closed her fingers over the jade pendant. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The shame belongs to them." Their shared moment of honesty was shattered by the sound of an approaching wagon. Arthur was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the Winchester he kept by the door. He peered through the window. A buckboard was pulling up in the yard. In the fading light, he could make out 3 figures. One was Jedediah Vance. The other 2, an older man and woman with hard, pinched faces, he recognized instantly. It was the Chins. A sick feeling rose in his throat. They had come back. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the rifle held loosely at his side. Mei Lin stood behind him in the doorway, her face a mask of terror. "What do you want, Vance?" Arthur demanded. Vance smirked, gesturing to the couple beside him. "Mr. and Mrs. Chin have come for their daughter-in-law. They were worried about her. Seems they heard you'd taken her in. They're concerned for her welfare. And her honor." The old man, Mr. Chin, stepped forward. He was a small, wiry man with eyes like chips of flint. "You have our son's wife," he said in heavily accented English. "This is not right. You shame our family." "Shame?" Arthur's voice was dangerously low. "You're the ones who left her in the street to die." "A misunderstanding," Mrs. Chin chirped, her voice falsely sweet. "We were overcome with grief. We came back for her as soon as we could." It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Arthur could see the greed in their eyes. They had heard he was a landowner. They must have thought he was a man of means, and they had come to extort him. "She's not going with you," Arthur said flatly. Vance stepped forward, his face alight with triumph. "Now, Art, that could be seen as kidnapping. The law might take an interest. A U.S. Marshal might ask why you're keeping this poor, grieving woman against her will. Her word against yours. And, of course, her family's word." The threat was plain. In a territorial court, Mei Lin's testimony would be worth nothing. It would be their word against his, and Vance had already poisoned the town against him. They had him trapped. Mr. Chin named his price. It was a staggering sum, $200. He claimed it was a dowry in reverse, a payment to soothe the family's honor and to compensate them for the loss of their son's wife's labor. It was extortion, pure and simple. It was also, by a cruel coincidence, almost the exact amount Arthur had saved over 3 years, money he was planning to use to buy a breeding bull and secure the future of his ranch. He looked at Mei Lin. She was shaking, her eyes pleading with him not to do it, to let her go, to save himself. He looked at Vance's smug face and the Chin's avaricious eyes. He saw his future, his land, his dream hanging in the balance. Paying them would set him back years. It would cripple him. He made his decision. "Wait here," he said, his voice dead. He went back inside the cabin, Maylin following him. "No, Arthur," she begged, grabbing his arm. "Do not, please." He gently removed her hand. "It's only money, Maylin." He walked to the loose floorboard beneath his bed, pulled out the small, heavy lockbox, and counted out the coins and paper script. It was everything he had. He walked back onto the porch and dropped the heavy canvas bag of money into Mr. Chen's outstretched hands. The man's eyes lit up as he felt the weight. "You will never bother her again," Arthur said, his voice a low promise. "You will not speak her name. You will not come back to this valley. If you do, this money will be the last thing you ever hold. Do you understand me?" The threat in his eyes was so absolute that Mr. Chen took a step back, nodding quickly. He and his wife scurried back to the wagon like rats. Vance gave Arthur a final, triumphant glare before turning to leave. As the wagon rattled away into the darkness, Arthur stood on the porch, the now useless rifle in his hand. He felt hollowed out, the weight of his sacrifice pressing down on him. He had won her freedom, but he was sure he had just lost everything else. Maylin came to stand beside him, her small hand finding his. She didn't say anything. She just stood with him, a silent partner in his ruin. The first snows of winter came early that year, blanketing the valley in a deep, cleansing white. The 3 months since the Chen's visit had been the hardest of Arthur's life. With his savings gone, he couldn't afford the new bull, and the harsh winter took 2 of his oldest cows. He and Maylin survived on what they had stored, their diet spare but sufficient. The town of Redemption Gulch, led by Jedediah Vance, continued its silent shunning. Yet something unexpected had taken root in the small, isolated cabin. The shared hardship had forged a bond between them stronger than steel. They worked together, a partnership of few words but perfect understanding. He taught her how to mend fences and tend to the stock. She, in turn, showed him how to cultivate a small winter garden in a cold frame she built against the south wall of the cabin from scrap wood and an old window pane. Miraculously, tender green shoots pushed through the dark soil, promising fresh food in the dead of winter. Their evenings were spent by the fire. He would read aloud from an old book of poems, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. She would listen, mending their worn clothes, her needle moving with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. She began to teach him words in her language, her laughter soft and warm when he stumbled over the pronunciations. The cabin, once just a shelter for a lonely man, had become a home, filled with a quiet warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, she looked up from her mending. "Arthur," she said, her voice soft, "your heart is good, but your ranch, it suffers because of me." He put down his book and looked at her. The firelight danced in her dark eyes. "The ranch is just land and wood, Maylin. It was empty before. Now it's not." In that moment he realized the truth of his own words. He had thought Vance had taken everything from him, but he had been wrong. The money, the town's approval, even the land itself, it was all meaningless compared to what he had found. He had found a partner. He had found a reason. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were small and warm in his. "I wouldn't trade it," he said. "Not for anything." A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up the entire room. She leaned forward and, with a gentle hesitation, pressed her lips to his cheek. The touch was feather light, but it sent a jolt through him, a warmth that spread all the way to his soul. When spring finally broke, the valley came alive. The creek swelled with melted snow, and the pastures turned to vibrant green. With the new season came a change in their fortunes. A traveling livestock agent passing through the territory was so impressed with the health of Arthur's small herd, despite the harsh winter, that he offered him a generous price for 2 of his yearlings. The money wasn't enough for a prize bull, but it was enough to buy supplies and seed, enough to start again. When Arthur rode into Redemption Gulch, he did so with his head held high. He bypassed Vance's store and went directly to the freight office, placing his order with a freighter who passed through weekly. People watched him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and grudging respect. He had survived the winter. He had survived their shunning. He was still standing. Mei Lin, using the seeds he brought back, planted a sprawling garden. Her knowledge of planting and cultivation was astonishing. By midsummer, their garden was overflowing with vegetables Arthur had never even seen before, alongside staples like corn, beans, and squash. They had more than they could eat. Mei Lin began bundling the extra produce. One market day she went with him to town. She walked beside him, no longer the broken woman in a sullied white dress, but a confident partner in a simple, sturdy calico dress she had sewn herself. They set up a small stall near the livery, and she laid out her vegetables. At first people were hesitant, but the quality of the produce was undeniable. Slowly, one by one, the women of the town, tired of Vance's high prices and wilted goods, began to buy from her. Her quiet dignity and the simple honesty of her business won them over. By the end of the day, they had sold everything. Jedediah Vance stood in the doorway of his store, his face a thundercloud, as he watched his customers walk away with baskets full of food from Arthur and Mei Lin's ranch. The tide had turned. That autumn, a year after he had found her, Arthur received an official letter. It was the deed to his land, his homestead claim fully and legally granted. The challenge had been dismissed months ago for lack of evidence. Vance's power had been broken not by a fight, but by the quiet, unyielding power of their partnership. That evening he stood on the porch with Mei Lin, the deed held in his hand. She stood beside him, her shoulder just brushing his, looking out over the land that was now, legally and spiritually, theirs. He looked down at her feet, now clad in sturdy leather boots, and remembered the first time he had seen them, bare and bleeding in the dust. "We did it," he said, his voice quiet. "Yes," she replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "We built a home." He knew then that a home wasn't a claim you filed or a cabin you built with timber. It was something you earned, something you forged in the fire of hardship with someone who saw you, truly saw you, and chose to stand with you. He slipped his arm around her waist, and she leaned into him, two solitary figures who had found their place in the world, together. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.